And we've discussed this quite a bit on the show in recent years about academies and about the idea of whether or not that's actually the right way to go. If getting poached as a 12, 13-year-old is good for you as a footballer, whereas if you go to a lower division, if you're an Irish footballer playing in the League of Ireland for a little while, establishing yourself as a young footballer at senior level, instead of getting babysat through these academies, it does seem to be that is the better way to go.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, if I look back to my own career, there was a pathway. Norwich City were a first division club, or the equivalent of a Premier League club back then. But when I broke into the youth team, you're one step away from the reserves, and of course the reserves is one step away from the first team. There was a very small first team squad, and it was literally if a first team player was injured, then the player who was playing well, the best in the reserves, would get that chance. So from very quickly playing for my school team, within a year I was playing for Norwich City reserves against established first division players as they were back then, the likes of Roy Wegerle, Paul Walsh, Vinnie Samways, really good footballers. And I couldn't believe, I wouldn't have believed that had somebody told me that the year previous, when I wasn't attached to any club. And of course, then you get the confidence from that. And then I got my opportunity in the first team through an injury. Nowadays, I think if you're a young player, I think you make a good point, the pathway is blocked. It's a numbers game. That's not to say some young players don't get through, because of course they do. But I think, the sensible approach now for most young players is actually, you talked about the League of Ireland, and Scotland should be another breeding ground for developing players. But in England, certainly at Premier League level, the pathway is blocked. And then you have, the likes of clubs. There's a chapter on stockpiling players, the likes of clubs like Chelsea, Manchester United. It's a business within a business, isn't it? And it's a money-making scheme, but it certainly makes it more and more difficult for young players to make that breakthrough.
And even at the very top level, in the talents of the most incredible kids that we see coming through, it can be difficult. Like the Jadon Sancho case study is an interesting one at the moment, where he might end up playing for Manchester United, having not made the breakthrough at Manchester City. Now, of course, there are added complications around this, where had he waited another year, Pep Guardiola probably would have given him a chance at the same time as Phil Foden. And there was a little bit of impatience on Jadon Sancho's side. At the same time, you applaud a kid for backing himself. I'm keen to get your take on that whole situation, and whether or not Manchester City will be regretting that, or is it actually just feeding into the whole idea of stockpiling players too much, and that's why City have found themselves in this situation?
It's a really interesting one, that, isn't it? I take my hat off to Jadon Sancho. I mean, there's a strong argument. I don't know how you feel about this, and how other people feel about this, that Phil Foden, for his talent, still hasn't had enough game time for Manchester City. I think he's played I think this season is something like 6 Premier League appearances. I may be wrong. That's off the top of my head. But that's not enough. And in the last few seasons, I think we've all been saying this should be Phil Foden's season, where he gets the opportunity. Now with David Silva leaving, we would expect him to get more game time. But I think that with Jadon Sancho, he should be applauded for actually having the strength of character to say, well, do you know what? And the intelligence to look at the situation and think, do you know what, I'm not going to play here, and it's okay. I'll be training with great players every day, and that may benefit my development, but I want to go out and play games. And he went across to the Bundesliga, and his reputation has really, really grown, and real credit to him for doing that. And now we see a lot of younger players actually following the same path. So in many respects, Jadon Sancho has been a pioneer.
It does seem that is like, exactly as you said it, you would not be surprised to see another bunch of youngsters following that exact same path at this moment. Instead of asking yourself, will I break into this Liverpool or City team? You know what? My agent's got a Bundesliga club lined up for me. Why not even just try it out for a year or two?
Yeah, and the Bundesliga is a fantastic league. I'm a big fan of the way the German teams play. But is that not a common sense approach? You know, it's not about what money they're earning. These boys are hungry. They want to get on. They want to establish themselves. And because of that, you know, I think it's a really sensible approach, and we're seeing it more and more often now. I mean, it's interesting. I think is that Jude Bellingham, Manchester United, showing a strong interest in him, weren't they? And he's another one who's gone across to the Bundesliga. And it's something which now I think that the Premier League clubs will have to seriously start to think about, and maybe giving young, I mean, it may change in terms of their approach, and thinking, well, do you know what? We might have to give these young, talented players more opportunity. But then, you know, there's another argument that managers are under so much pressure these days, you know, if they don't win, you know, within 4 or 5 games, if they lose 6 games on the trot, then they get the sack anyway. So, you know, that's another chapter.
It's a vicious cycle, isn't it? And it's actually interesting that post-lockdown, we saw potentially more kids getting just a little bit more game time, like Foden racking up a few more appearances. You had like Bukayo Saka and Mason Greenwood all of a sudden looking good, because there wasn't a transfer window for anybody to sign them, replacements in the off-season, and the pressure that the managers feel couldn't be channeled into, you know, spending millions of pounds, and perhaps that was one of the reasons for that. One of the other things I wanted to ask you about in the book,
and the club.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, and the clubs have assets now. Now, I live in a place called Norfolk, which is, you know, the local club's Norwich City. Now, Norwich City, you know, when I got my breakthrough, it was a club renowned for developing youth players, and, you know, had a very good record of developing players. The likes of Craig Bellamy came through at Norwich City. For the older listeners, that, you know, the likes of Ruel Fox and Dale Gordon, and it was a you know, real conveyor belt. And then when the club got relegated from the Premier League under Alex Neil, they had players on huge wages, and Norwich, of course, came up with under Daniel Farker, got relegated again. But all last season, Daniel Farker was talking about the club paying for mistakes of the past financially. You know, the club were in a tricky situation. Therefore, they couldn't spend the money in the transfer market. They were looking to reduce the wage bill. What's happened then? The club went and looked, what have we got developing in our own academy? The likes of Max Aarons, Jamal Lewis, who was heavily linked with Liverpool. Todd Cantwell has come through. Ben Godfrey, a player who they brought from York, a young player, who, you know, I see quoted as, you know, a figure sort of 30, 40 million for him, albeit I think he's got development to do. But now Norwich City, in their team, in their first team, they have players who have real value, who they have given the opportunity to. So there's a lesson there for Norwich, you know, for Norwich and a lot of other clubs. And I hope Norwich stick with that model from now on in.